Hello and welcome to the Storm of Scripture. Today's lesson is going to be a little different than our usual approach to Scripture. I'm normally all about digging into details or giving a nice steady pace, chapter by chapter, through a book. But in this video, I'm going to be examining the book of Revelation from a big picture vantage point. I'm calling it Revelation from 35,000 feet. Because we're going to be skimming through the book at a pretty high level. I will dip into some details here or there as the details influence the approach to the overall book. In fact, sometimes I'm critical of approaches to Revelation when they focus only on details such that a small section of the book is made to be clearly understood by divorcing it from its surrounding context, so that an image here or a phrase there becomes the whole focus of the interpretation, rather than how that image or phrase is woven into the text of the entire book. Or sometimes, on the other extreme, an approach to Revelation takes that big picture approach but fails to take into account the details and makes assertions that work if you ignore the details, but don't resonate if you look at the details. So you have to ignore those things in order to make sense of what's going on with the flow of the book. I believe an adequate and correct interpretation of Revelation is going to work at every level. It works at the highest level as providing an understanding of the narrative flow from beginning to end. The structure of the book makes sense according to the interpretation. And yet, if you go down deeper into the individual chapter level and individual paragraph, the interpretation works there too. So that at whatever point you're looking at the book of Revelation, you feel comfortable that what you're looking at works for the immediate context immediately around the verse that you're examining and works in the bigger picture. And it is a challenge to find an interpretation that works at both the granular, in the weeds level and at the big picture level. First, before we get into the chapter-by-chapter summary of the book, I would like to touch on four major themes. There are multiple themes throughout the book of Revelation, and someone might suggest other themes that work just as well as major themes, but I believe there are at least these four. First, Jesus Christ is always with his people to comfort and to challenge them. Even before Christ returns with his second coming, Christ is with his church. The opening of the book begins with that, and there are moments throughout the book of Revelation where the presence of Christ with his church is tangibly felt in the vision. Secondly, God is in control of every situation. No matter what is going on, God has his hand in the unfolding history of the church and the history of the world. God is in control. Third, the righteous will be vindicated and the wicked punished. This is always the open question. Why is it that people who are wicked seem to enjoy their lives, have what appear to be blessings in their lives, and live long and happy lives, whereas righteous people die young, are persecuted, seem to make sacrifices that narrow their experiences and make their happiness less full? Is the sacrifice of righteousness worth it in the end? That's the open question that Revelation gives a resounding answer to. Yes, the wicked will be punished for doing wicked things, and the righteous will be blessed, far above how the wicked have enjoyed their lives. And finally, a very important connection. The events in the unseen realm influence events in our visible world, and vice versa. We see over and over again in Revelation the unseen realm, the supernatural realm, influencing events on earth, as items that originate in heaven are thrown to the earth, and then they cause earthquakes or other devastation on the planet. These things originate in the supernatural realm, but they end up with tangible effects. However, we should not lose sight of the fact that events in the visible realm also influence the unseen realm. The prayers of the saints, perhaps most obviously through the book, they are lifted up to heaven, and heaven responds to the prayers of those on earth. Heaven also responds to the martyrdom, to the deaths of the faithful on earth. The events on earth influence what happens in the supernatural realm, and the events in the supernatural realm certainly affect what happens on earth. With those themes in mind, let's step through very briefly, chapter by chapter, the book of Revelation. I'm going to give a one-sentence summary for each of the chapters in Revelation. Clearly not enough to give you a real feel for what's going on. So I would encourage you always to read through the book of Revelation, and I would encourage you to read through it in one sitting. It may take a little longer than reading through a short book like one of Paul's epistles, but it's worth the effort to read through the whole book and get a feel for the flow from beginning to end. After you've done that, you might want to come back and then we'll walk through it together. For those who may have read it before and just need a refresher, I'm going to give a one-sentence summary in order to just get us all on the same page with the basic structure of the book. In chapter 1, after he gives greetings, John describes the vision of the glorified Jesus among lampstands, which represent his churches. In chapter 2, Jesus consoles and challenges his churches in Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, and Thyatira. In chapter 3, Jesus consoles and challenges his churches in Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. The 7 churches mentioned in chapters 2 and 3 are the primary audience for the book of Revelation. We should always remember that what John has written needs to resonate with the people in the pews, metaphorically, of those 7 churches in the first century. When they receive this message from the hand of John, it needs to mean something to them, something tangible that they will find consolation and challenge in, not just in these words of Jesus in chapters 2 and 3, but throughout the book. In chapter 4, John enters heaven and witnesses the divine council worshiping God on his throne. I use the divine council as a reference to what's going on in this chapter. I'll mention here that some of my summary is going to be interpretive to a certain degree. In other words, what's described in imagery in the book, I am going to give as a interpretive meaning for what the images are, simply because I can condense a lengthy passage into a shorter one by giving that interpretive explanation as part of my summary. Not everyone will agree with the terms that I use or with my summaries of these chapters. I understand that, but this will give you an idea of how I'm interpreting certain bits of the passage as I read through the rest of these summary statements. In chapter 5, John is not allowed to receive a scroll to eat, as Ezekiel did. I find a lot of parallels between the book of Ezekiel and the book of Revelation. One of my interpretive keys is going back to Ezekiel to see how the revelation of John and the prophecy of Ezekiel have certain things in common and certain things that make them different. The fact that there's a scroll introduced early on in the prophecy is something they have in common. But whereas Ezekiel eats the scroll immediately, John cannot even receive it because it is sealed. However, the Lamb does take the scroll to unseal it. In chapter 6, 4 divine horsemen surround Rome. Martyrs seek vengeance, and omens presage the Lamb's wrath. I'll take another moment as we walk through the summary to point out that I have been walking through the book of Revelation passage by passage, almost verse by verse, and I have videos that explain my interpretations of all of these chapters. So if you are wondering why I say the 4 divine horsemen surround Rome, I'd encourage you to go back and watch the video on the first few verses of chapter 6, which will explain my interpretation. In chapter 7, all the tribes of Israel and all the nations have people shepherded by the Lamb and sealed ahead of the wrath. In chapter 8, after silence and a throne censer, trumpets unleash wrath on Rome via 4 areas: the earth, the sea, the springs, and heaven. In chapter 9, supernatural locusts torment the people of Rome, and an angelic army invades across the Euphrates, destroying Rome. Chapter 10, Jesus stands on earth and sea with an open scroll, which John takes and eats so he can prophesy again. In chapter 11, John hears about 2 witnesses who die at the hands of a beast, but rise again before a great earthquake. In chapter 12, a dragon tries to destroy Israel and her child, but Jesus is taken to heaven and the dragon thrown out. In chapter 13, 2 beasts rise, one from the sea, one from the earth, deceiving humanity, blaspheming God, and killing Christians. In chapter 14, Jesus stands with his people in Jerusalem while angels harvest the grapes of God's wrath. In chapter 15, in heaven, those martyred by the beast worship God, while 7 angels prepare bowls of wrath. In chapter 16, the beast's kingdom suffers wrath. All 6 bowls are poured out. The beast musters against Jerusalem, and Babylon falls to an earthquake. In chapter 17, an angel takes John to see the fall of Babylon up close. It's visualized as a harlot on the back of the beast. In chapter 18, heaven celebrates, but kings and merchants mourn the economic and cultural cost of the fall of Babylon. In chapter 19, heaven rejoices, anticipating the return of Jesus. And Jesus does return on a white horse, and he defeats the beast. In chapter 20, Satan is chained. Jesus reigns 1,000 years. Satan is then released and ultimately defeated and thrown into a fiery lake, and the dead are judged. In chapter 21, John sees and describes the New Jerusalem. God and the Lamb are its temple and its son. And in Revelation 22, John describes the river of life, the tree of life, and gives final messages of invitation, warning, and hope. That is the 35,000 feet, truly high-level overview of the book of Revelation, with a lot of interpretation peppered in, along with some of the more literal descriptions of what are in each of the chapters. I'm going to walk through some sections of Revelation at a little more detail, so bear with me as we continue through the study. Let's talk a little bit about the structure of the book. I am not at all in left field with dividing the book into 2 halves, right at the seam between chapters 11 and 12. A Bible Project has 2 videos on Revelation. They go 1 through 11 and then 12 through 22. Many commentaries that are written on the book of Revelation are written about the 2 halves separately because there's so much to cover. There'll be 2 volumes on Revelation, chapters 1 through 11, and another volume on chapters 12 through 22. This is a common way of seeing some structure in the book as 2 halves, 1 through 11 and 12 through 22. Where I diverge from most interpreters is in seeing how these two halves function. I believe the first 11 chapters have as their primary context Rome, the Roman Empire of John's day. John in Patmos is writing to churches in the Roman Empire about their suffering and about their friends and family members who have died at the hands either of the Romans directly or perhaps by Jewish persecutions, which were also common in the first century as the Jews began to reject Christians. We see that happening in the book of Acts, and it only continues throughout the first century. And the Romans get in on the act a little bit later. I believe chapters 1 through 11 have to do with Roman persecution of Christians and God's judgment against Rome for that persecution. The second half of the book, chapters 12 through 22, have to do with the end times, what most people traditionally associate the whole book with, talking about what is going to happen just before Christ returns. That is called eschatology, and the period of time that immediately precedes Christ's return is called the eschaton, or the end of time, the end things, eschaton being from the Greek for last things. So I believe that the book is divided into these two big sections. 11 chapters focused on the immediate context of Rome, John and his immediate audience dealing with that, and the second half dealing with the end times. John is still giving a message for those 7 churches, but wanting them to think about the fact that God's plan is bigger than just vengeance against Rome. God's plan extends into the future where Jesus will enact the final day of judgment and bring justice for the whole world and deal with the problem of evil even more fundamentally than just dealing with the problem of Rome. I see a subdivision within each of these two broad sections into 5 subsections, 5 movements within each of these two halves. The first one in each half are preliminaries that set up situations prior to the immediate circumstances that bring judgment. Secondly, there's a prelude. There are some things that happen before the judgment is going to get going, some things that have to be put in place or some messages that need to be conveyed. There's a prelude prior to the immediate judgment. And even after the prelude, there's a period of preparation. There are some actions that God will take that will prepare for the judgment to come. And then there is that judgment itself, the punishment of judgment that is poured out as trumpets in the first half, as bowls in the second half. There is the actual punishment that is meted out on the wicked. The preparation is mostly about protecting the faithful and the righteous, and the punishment is about the judgment on the wicked. And then finally, in each section, there is a postlude. There is something that happens after the punishment has been meted out that will set the stage for the next phase. Whether that phase is the long period between the fall of Rome and Jesus' second coming, or the period that follows his second coming into the eternal state, there is a postlude. The division of each of these major sections is like this. Chapters 1 through 3 are preliminaries to the judgment on Rome. Chapters 4 and 5 are the prelude. Chapters 6 and 7 form the preparation. That includes the unsealing of the scroll. That is preparation for punishment on Rome. Then chapters 8 and 9 are the execution of punishment. That is the blowing of the trumpets, the first 6 trumpets. Then chapters 10 and 11 are the postlude to judgment on Rome. That includes the narrative about the 2 witnesses and the final trumpet. Chapter 12 then shifts to the preliminaries for the eschaton, preliminaries to that final judgment at the end of days. Then the prelude is chapter 13. Chapters 14 and 15 are the preparation for that punishment. It includes the strong metaphor of the grapes of wrath and the harvests of those grapes and preparation for the pouring out of the bowls of wrath. The pouring out of those bowls and some other elements of punishment are described in 5 chapters, chapters 16 through 20. The single longest section focuses on this punishment, perhaps because it is the last one. It is the punishment and judgment that will come at the very end. It is the climax of the entire trajectory of the book, the idea of final judgment and punishment on wickedness itself, the very source of evil on earth. And then we have the postlude, chapters 21 and 22, in which John describes the New Jerusalem, the new eternal state after punishment has been meted out, and includes his final messages at the end. I would be remiss in talking about the structure of the book if I didn't mention the many sevens that are in it. No commentary on Revelation is going to miss the fact that there are sevens all throughout it. 7 churches to receive the message in the beginning, 7 seals on the scroll that John can't receive right up front, 7 trumpets, which are the punishment, 7 thunders, which we don't quite hear what they have to say because John is told not to write it down. 7 angels, this is not as clear cut, but there is in that preparation for the eschaton in chapters 14 and 15, we can count 7 angels at work in that area. There are 7 bowls that are poured out that are like the 7 trumpets. And then there are the 7 hills, which are also 7 heads, which are described in the chapter 17. So all of these are very prominent sevens that appear throughout the book. Most commentators point out that 7 is a number of completion, and Revelation is about the process that will bring us to the completion of God's plan for humanity, his plan for justice and judgment, opening up the eternal state to follow. If you want to dive in just a little bit closer than 35,000 feet, I'm going to walk through each of these 5 phases. I don't normally like to simply read to you what's on my slides, but at this point, I feel like in order to keep this brief, I'm going to simply do that. If you have questions or want to hear more about any of the things I'm describing here, I would encourage you to go to those other videos here on the Storeroom of Scripture YouTube channel to look for that level of granularity that walks through the book piece by piece. I'm just going to very rapidly summarize my interpretations of each of these 5 sections in each half of the book, starting with the preliminaries in Rome, chapters 1 through 3. John gives opening greetings and a benediction. Then he has a vision of Jesus as the glorified Son of Man, walking among the lampstands that are the 7 churches of Asia Minor. John then receives messages from Jesus to each of the 7 churches, reflecting his intimate knowledge of their circumstances and promising his intervention to right the wrongs of each one. That will come in the form of either consolation for their suffering or potentially punishment when the churches themselves have gotten off track with false teachers or apathy or any of the other issues that Jesus identifies. But the point of this whole section is that Jesus is with the churches. He knows what's going on with the churches because he is with them in their presence, even if they can't see him. In the prelude to the justice that will come on Rome, which is chapters 4 and 5, we see John invited into heaven. And he describes the throne room scene, including God on his throne at the center, surrounded by a circle of 24 thrones on which are seated elders in white, And at the 4 cardinal directions are 4 living creatures that are full of eyes. Many of the details in this section echo Ezekiel chapters 1 through 3, including the appearance of a scroll written inside and out. However, Ezekiel is given the scroll to eat, representing him receiving the message he's going to go deliver to the people. But John cannot receive the scroll because it's sealed, and there is no one worthy to open it in heaven or on earth or under the earth. So he weeps. Jesus alone is worthy to open the scroll, and he appears as a lamb that has been slaughtered and yet is standing. He has 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are emblematic of the Holy Spirit. All creation worships the Lamb. As preparation begins for the Roman judgment in chapters 6 and 7, the Lamb opens each of the first 4 seals on the scroll. One of the living creatures calls forth a rider on horseback to his point on the compass. A rider with a bow on a white horse goes to the east, representing war with Parthia. A rider with a sword on a red horse goes to the west, representing civil war so often stirred up in Gaul. A rider with a balance scales on a black horse goes to the south, towards Egypt, the breadbasket of Rome. And a rider named Death on a pale green horse goes north, which would be into the wild lands of Germania. The barbarians and the wild beasts of that were always a threat to Roman peace and security. The 5th seal reveals martyrs under an altar, which is a sacred space. Even within the sacred space of the temple, the altar where the blood was poured out after each sacrifice was particularly sacred. These martyrs are reassured that vindication for their spilled blood will come, though there will be more death among the righteous before it happens. The 6th seal unleashes a series of omens that even the pagans will understand as harbingers of divine wrath for the wickedness of Rome. The wrath is held back, though, until the righteous are sealed, starting with 144,000 that represent a remnant of every tribe of Israel mustered for spiritual warfare. John looks for the remnant, but when he looks, he sees a great crowd from every nation, tribe, and people worshiping before God's throne, and all shepherded by the Lamb. In chapters 8 and 9 is then the punishment to be meted out on Rome. After the 7th seal is broken, there is silence, and what is probably the final bit of preparation ahead of the trumpet judgments. An angel mixes the prayers of the saints with fire from the altar and throws the mixture to earth, bringing elements of God's presence to the earth. Earthquakes, lightning, thunder. These, all of the elements that are on earth because of the censer that is thrown, are the same elements that were on Mount Sinai when Moses and the Israelites were there to receive the law. The elements represent God's presence. Yes, it can be threatening. The Israelites at Mount Sinai were frightened by the lightning and the thunders and the sounds that were coming off the mountain, but it was emblematic of God's presence, not of God's punishment, although the wicked have reason to fear God's presence because of his punishment. The first 4 trumpets describe God's power in bringing judgment in each of 4 domains of creation: earth, the sea, which is the salt water, the streams, which are fresh water, and the heavens, which is the word for sky. In Greek, there is no distinction between the word for heavens and the word for sky. The fact that each of these trumpet judgments is restricted to about 1/3 is significant. It suggests that Rome is the target because Rome did cover about 1/3 of the known world around the Mediterranean Sea. In every case, each trumpet unleashes an unseen spiritual power that brings about tangible suffering on earth. The last 3 trumpets are grouped as 3 woes. The 5th trumpet releases supernatural locusts that bring disease and pain, but not death, for 5 months, tapping into a fifth domain, if you will, the underworld abyss. To go along with the earth, the sea, the streams, and the heavens is this underworld, the abyss. The sixth trumpet, or the second woe, brings a truly staggeringly large army of supernatural horses and riders across the Euphrates, which would be into Roman territory. It is an army so vast and so powerful, it can only spell the end of Rome. And indeed, this cavalry, originating from the region of the Parthians, is said to kill a third of the people of Earth. At which point, you're probably saying something along the lines of, hold up, Rome did not fall to the Parthians. Was John's vision wrong? Are you saying that John was falsely predicting the fall of Rome to the Parthians? Here is the brief thumbnail assessment. John had a vision of a future that was not written in stone. It was not time travel into the future where he was seeing things from a perspective of when they had already occurred. He's having a vision of something in the future. The vision is of what would happen if there was no intercession for Rome and no repentance by Rome. Consider Jeremiah chapter 18, verses 7 through 10, and Amos chapter 7, verses 1 through 6. I don't have time here to go into that because I'm trying to make this a quick high-level overview. Both of these passages reflect the idea that a vision or a prophecy is of a future judgment that can fail to come to pass because the circumstances change, either repentance or intercession. For another example of something similar, see 1 Samuel chapter 23, verses 10 through 13. That's an example of someone, particularly in this case, David, intentionally changing the circumstances from a prophecy of God. God says certain things are going to happen. Someone intentionally changes the circumstances so that those things cannot happen. Was God wrong? No, it was because the prophetic word was given when a certain set of circumstances were prevalent, and when those circumstances changed, it was no longer even possible for the prophecy to come true. I believe something along these lines must have happened with Rome, and that is why Rome did not fall to the Parthians. I give the most explanation in my overview video on Revelation chapters 1 through 9, starting about 43 minutes in, where I discuss chapter 9 in more detail. At the end of that video, you'll hear the discussion. It touches on Jeremiah and Amos as examples of why it is possible for this to be genuinely a prophetic word, and yet it not transpire exactly as described at the end of Revelation chapter 9. Rome did, of course, fall. Eventually, it fell to the barbarians from the north and not the Parthians from the east, but it did fall, which puts us in the postlude after the fall of Rome, described in chapters 10 and 11. I'll point out that chapter 9 ends with the observation that even though a third of the people of earth had died, in my view that means Rome fell, the problem of evil was not resolved. It may be the point of the narrative so far to bring John and his readers to the awareness that bringing about the downfall of one empire, even an empire so great as Rome, will not end sin among humanity. Chapter 10 opens with an angel straddling earth and sea, holding an open scroll. The same scroll, I believe, that the Lamb unsealed in chapter 6. John is now prepared to receive the larger message of his vision, one that transcends the question of vengeance for the Christians martyred by Rome in particular. This is described in the visionary language of John eating the scroll, just as the prophet Ezekiel had eaten in his vision. Chapter 11 contains the message in the form of a parable concerning, first, the measuring of the temple, the altar, and those who worship there, and second, the tale of two witnesses who are supernaturally empowered to prophesy, before being killed by a beast who makes war on them, only to be resurrected and called into heaven ahead of a great earthquake and the fall of the city. The seventh trumpet, which is the third woe, is followed by a voice from heaven describing the ultimate victory of the Lamb, the judgment of the dead, and the opening of the temple. Chapter 11 is a thumbnail of what will unfold in more detail in chapters 13 to 20. Chapter 12 then turns to preliminaries for the eschaton. Even though the focus now here is on the end things, the end of time, and the final judgment, it begins with some preliminaries which will back us up to encapsulate the whole scope of struggle between Satan, depicted as a dragon in the vision, and the people of God, particularly Israel, depicted as a woman in this vision. The woman gives birth to a son, who is Jesus. His entire earthly ministry is summarized in a single verse, chapter 12, verse 5. Yet, his entrance in this new vision breaks the power of the dragon, enabling Michael and his angels to throw the dragon and his angels to earth, depriving them of any legitimate authority in heaven. Exiled to earth, the dragon tries to eradicate the woman, but she escapes thanks to natural forces. This whole picture of the war in heaven, echoed by the disturbances on earth, could perhaps be an image of the Jewish war around AD 70, because the woman disappears after that. I believe the woman is national Israel, and after the Jewish war and the reprisals of Rome against Judea for that war, the Jews were no longer an identifiable political structure, not until 1948, when I believe a thoroughly political and not biblical Israel was created. In chapter 12, the dragon is left only able to vent his fury on the children of the woman. I believe that represents faithful Jews and Christians. These two groups, the faithful Jews, who are faithful to God's Messiah, also are Christians. Though they have Jewish heritage, they still follow the teachings of Christ. And then there are the Gentile Christians as well. These two groups essentially merge to become just Christians, or the saints, throughout the rest of the book of Revelation. Chapter 13 describes a prelude to the eschaton. The dragon waits on the seashore for the appearance of a beast from the sea that he can use to further his war on the children of the woman. The dragon empowers the beast from the sea after it rises, and the beast from the sea empowers a second beast, a beast from the earth, who creates an idolatrous image of the beast from the sea and imbues it with breath and the ability to speak. The empire, established or perhaps inherited by the beast from the sea, is the last great empire before Christ's return. It is marked by targeted persecutions of Christians in political ways, chapter 13, verse 7, in religious ways, chapter 13, verse 15, and economic ways, chapter 13, verse 17. The mark of the beast on the hand or forehead is the mechanism for enforcing the economic persecution. Chapters 14 and 15 describe the preparation for judgment in the eschaton. While the beast from the sea is reigning, a group of 144,000 believers gathers in Jerusalem on Mount Zion to worship. This group is meant to echo the 144,000 from chapter 7, in that they are a remnant. The 144,000 in chapter 7 are a remnant of Israel. But after the persecutions of the beast from the sea and the beast from the earth and the dragon, this is the remnant of saints, the remnant of believers who gathers in Jerusalem, joining in with a heavenly chorus echoing the worship from chapter 4. 3 angels deliver messages to this assembly. The first proclaims the eternal good news and that the hour of judgment has come. The second announces the fall of Babylon, which is the kingdom of the beast, given a proper name. The third describes the eternal torment of those loyal to the beast. In an aside direct to the reader, the Spirit contrasts the eternal torment, just mentioned, with the eternal rest of those faithful to Jesus. John then describes two harvests of earth. One is a harvest of grain performed by Jesus as a Son of Man on a cloud, which seems to be a visionary way of describing the legacy of righteousness that will sustain the faithful. The second is a harvest of grapes, which seems to be the legacy of wickedness that will be distilled into the wine of God's wrath and poured out in chapter 16 on the kingdom of the beast. After the harvest, John sees a group of martyrs worshiping in the very spot in heaven where the divine council worshipped in chapter 4. They are a heavenly counterpart to the 144,000 worshiping in Jerusalem at the beginning of chapter 14. After John records the words of the Song of Moses and the Lamb, he describes one of the four living creatures giving 7 gold bowls filled with God's wrath to 7 angels. Then, in a moment that may echo the commissioning and decommissioning of the temple on earth, God's glory fills the heavenly temple to such a degree that even the angels cannot enter it to perform their duties. Now, the punishment in the eschaton covers chapters 16 to 20. So far, I've been able to summarize each one of these sections on a single slide. This will take 3 slides for us to work through all of the punishment on all the world in the eschaton. The punishment comes in phases, the first of which is the pouring out of the wrath of God in the 6 golden bowls. The first 4 bowls, like the first 4 trumpets, describe God's power in bringing judgment on each of 4 domains of creation: earth, sea, again, that's salt water; streams, again, that's fresh water; and the heavens, which is the sky. The target of these judgments is different, though. Whereas the trumpets targeted Rome, the bowls target the kingdom of the beast. I believe this is still not worldwide yet. This is still focused on a kingdom roughly situated on the same area as Babylon, on the other side of the Euphrates from where Israel sits, and covering ancient Persia or Babylon. The 5th bowl causes anguish, but not death, like the 5th trumpet did. The 6th bowl dries up the Euphrates, opening up a path from east to west. The beast musters his allies in the east together and marches on Jerusalem. Referred to here as Armageddon because of the overtones of the final battle to be waged there. The 7th and final bowl brings a statement, "It is done," from the throne, along with a great earthquake that was predicted at the blowing in the earlier chapter of the 7th trumpet. Babylon's fall is described in a summary way at the end of chapter 16, but then John is taken into the wilderness to observe the fall firsthand. Chapter 17 presents Babylon as a woman riding a beast, the same beast that rises from the sea in chapter 13. An angel explains the imagery of the vision, but he does so in a way that does not answer all of our questions. The end of the explanation makes it clear that Babylon, the city, will be destroyed by the actions of the beast and its allies, unwittingly fulfilling God's design. In chapter 18, we read of the fall of Babylon with more detail and being treated as a city rather than as a woman. Perhaps the most noteworthy feature of this chapter is that there are merchants and sailors mourning the destruction of the city from a distance. In other words, the destruction of Babylon is not the destruction of all civilization. It is the fall of the capital of an empire. It is not yet the end of all empires. Chapter 19 begins with a celebration of the fall of Babylon and the imminent marriage of the Lamb. This is followed by the return of Jesus physically to earth as a rider on a white horse. He is in a glorified form, even grander than in chapter 1, with many diadems on his head and a sharp sword in his mouth. After what I read as a flex, in which an angel invites birds to feast on the flesh of an army that is still just gathering for war, John describes that army's immediate defeat. The beasts from the sea and the earth, latter called a false prophet in this context, are thrown alive into a lake of fire, and the rest of the army is killed by the sword from Jesus' mouth. And the birds get their feast. Chapter 20 opens with one of the most difficult images to square with the eschatology of the rest of Scripture. The dragon, Satan, is captured and bound in the abyss. So far, so good. That idea that Satan will be bound for judgment fits, but he is only bound for 1,000 years. During the 1,000 years, Jesus reigns. However, he's not alone in that role. There are thrones with judges and resurrected martyrs who reign with Christ. The judges and the martyrs may be the same group. They may not be. Some commentaries take it as the same and some as different. This group is said to be the first resurrection and to be priests of God and Christ. After the 1,000 years, this is the millennium, Satan is released from prison, which is where it is difficult to square with other theology. Why would Satan, who has already been handled, be released? But he is released for a purpose, to deceive the nations that are the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. So it seems that Satan here is, perhaps unwittingly, doing God's will by bringing the nations together for battle. The very existence, though, of these extra kingdoms suggests that during the 1,000 years, the kingdom ruled by Jesus is not the only one on earth. There are still other kingdoms further off from Jerusalem than was Babylon, the kingdom of the beast, in chapters 13 through 19, and its allies. At least some of these, or perhaps all of them, are not loyal to Jesus. But for unstated reasons, they do not march against Jerusalem until Satan deceives them, perhaps deceiving them into thinking they can win. When they muster and march against the kingdom of Christ, they are consumed by fire where they stand. Satan is thrown into the same lake of fire as the beasts were earlier, to be tormented forever. The final act of judgment is the judgment of all the dead in front of the great white throne of God. There, books are read, and each one is a record of what each person has done, and the dead are judged accordingly. But there is another book, the book of life. Regardless of what was written in the individual diary of each life, if a person's name is not in the book of life, he or she was thrown into the lake of fire, along with death and Hades. Those whose names are in the book of life get to enter the New Jerusalem. This leads us to the postlude and the eschaton, chapters 21 and 22. In these chapters, John sees a new heaven, a new earth, and a new Jerusalem. The Spirit, in the form of the disembodied voice speaking from the throne, and the Father make statements affirming God's presence dwelling with his people, comforting the faithful, while the lake of fire remains as a place for the wicked. One of the 7 angels from the bowl judgments takes John on a tour of the New Jerusalem. John describes the walls and its gates, its gigantic measurements, its foundations and streets. Most striking of all is the lack of a temple and the fact that it does not need sun or moon because God gives its light. This light will also be for the nations, and there are still kingdoms apart from Jerusalem, but they are all loyal now to God and walk by that light. Flowing from the throne of God is the river of life, crossing through the middle of the street of the city, with the tree of life growing on both sides of the river, yielding a different kind of fruit every month. The book ends as it began, with several direct comments to the reader or hearer about God's blessings on the righteous and punishments on the wicked, plus the editorial voice pronouncing a curse on those who would add or take away from the words of the book. The book's final words are a statement of the imminence of Jesus' return. Lo, I am coming quickly, and a request for grace upon the reader. There we have a quick read-through of the book of Revelation and my interpretive take on some of those passages. Whether we agree or disagree on what the details mean in the book, I think we can all come to a certain agreement on the bottom line. The bottom line is stated in Revelation chapter 21, verses 6 and 8, part of the statement from the one on the throne. He said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give from the spring of the water of life without payment. The one who conquers will have this heritage, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death." This statement encapsulates the main idea of the whole book. God is ultimately the creator and the one who will bring everything to its conclusion. He is the Alpha and the Omega. He will bless the righteous and those who remain faithful. The one who conquers. It's not easy to stay faithful to Jesus, not easy to stay faithful to God. It's an effort. It is a conquering process, not by military might, but by the effort of a life lived faithfully. And that life will be blessed with living water and an intimate relationship with God that is eternal. But for those who are cowardly, who turn away from God, who do not finish faithfully, those wicked people will be punished in the lake of fire. The message of Revelation, ultimately one of hope for those who are faithful and a warning of punishment for those who are not. Thank you for taking this look at Revelation with me from 35,000 feet and getting a feel for the book as a whole. And until we have the opportunity to meet again to examine the treasures in the biblical text, may the Lord be with you.